Prairie Grove, Kansas, 1885. The courthouse was packed tighter than Sunday service. Every bench full, men standing along the back wall with their hats in their hands, because word had gotten around that Tom Calder, 20 years in this county, a man half the room had borrowed a plow or $1 from at some point, was about to lose everything he'd built to a railroad lawyer's paperwork. Tom sat at the defendant's table with his hands folded in front of him, dark hair falling loose over a face that had gone still, the way a man's face goes still when he's already made peace with losing. The judge was on his feet, mid-sentence, about to rule, his gavel already resting under his hand. Then the courthouse doors opened, and a young woman walked in fast, a worn leather folio pressed to her chest, dust from the road still on the hem of her pale blue dress. "Dad," she said, loud enough for the whole room to turn, "I'm here." Tom looked up, and for the first time in the whole proceeding, something other than resignation moved across his face. 15 long years earlier, she hadn't had a father at all. She had come off the Orphan train in the fall of 1870, 7 years old, born as best anyone could reckon it in March of 1863, wearing a paper number pinned to her coat and a name, Josephine Reed, that nobody in Prairie Grove yet knew belonged to anyone worth keeping. The trains had been running for over a decade by then, the Children's Aid Society's answer to New York's overcrowded streets, a program that would eventually carry some 200,000 children west before it ended. Children were looked over at each stop like something closer to livestock than family, chosen as much for the strength of their arms as for anything softer. Tom Calder hadn't planned to be at the station at all. He'd gone into town for feed and found half of Prairie Grove gathered around the platform. And he'd have kept walking if a girl near the back of the line hadn't looked directly at him instead of at her own feet, chin lifted, like she dared anyone to feel sorry for her. Tom Calder was 32 that autumn, a decade into ranching this land even before Mary died. And he had buried his wife and their infant son to diphtheria 2 winters before, and had told himself, standing at their grave, that a ranch could run well enough on one man's grief. Grief didn't ask to be fed or read to at night. It didn't look at you the way this girl was looking at him now. "You got a place for a girl who works hard?" she asked, before he'd said a word. "I've got a ranch that needs more hands than I've got," he said. "Can't promise it'll be easy." "Didn't ask if it'd be easy," Josephine said. He signed the paper an hour later in a station master's office that smelled of coal smoke, and drove her home in a wagon filled mostly with silence, both of them aware, in their own separate ways, that they'd just agreed to try being a family with a stranger. She sat with her hands folded in her lap the whole ride, watching the flat Kansas country roll past, and didn't ask a single question about where she was going or what would be expected of her there, which struck Tom, even then, as its own kind of quiet bravery. The first months weren't peaceful so much as watchful. Josephine didn't cry, didn't ask about the family she'd lost, and worked harder than any 7-year-old had business working. Chores finished before Tom woke, water hauled without being asked. It came to a head one evening when he found her scrubbing a pot that was already clean. "You don't have to earn your supper here," he said. "That's what the last people said too," Josephine said, not looking up, and something sharp came into her voice that hadn't been there before, the first real crack in the careful composure she'd been keeping since the platform. They said it right up until they didn't mean it anymore. Tom didn't argue with her. He sat down across the table instead and stayed there, saying nothing, until she finally set the pot down herself. "I'm not sending you back," he said. "Not for burning supper, not for breaking something, not for mouthing off at me on a bad day. Nothing you do is going to change that." She didn't believe him, not that night, and not for a good while after. There was a stretch that winter where she tested it on purpose, in the careful way children test things they desperately need to be true. Leaving a gate unlatched, answering him short when he asked her something plain, once staying out past dark just to see what he'd do about it. He never once threatened to send her anywhere. He came looking for her that night with a lantern, found her sitting in the hay barn with her knees pulled up, and sat down beside her without a word, until she was ready to walk back with him. "You're not going to scare me off that easy," he said finally, once they were back inside, hanging the lantern by the door. "Wasn't trying to scare you off," Josephine said, which they both knew wasn't entirely true. "Then quit testing it," he said, not unkindly. "I already told you where you stand. I'm not going to say it every week just because you need reminding." After that, the testing stopped, though it took most of that winter before she fully let go of the habit of expecting otherwise. He started teaching her things a person doesn't send a child back for knowing anyway. How to ride, how to read brands, how to shoot straight enough to bring down supper. He brought a book home from the schoolhouse shelf every week, whether she'd finished the last one or not, and some evenings just sat across from her while she read, mending a bridle, present without asking anything of her. It took most of that second winter before she stopped hauling water before he woke. Not because she'd stopped working hard, but because she'd started trusting there'd be a tomorrow to do it in. The Prairie fire came in the dry August of 1873, when Josephine was 10, faster than either of them had ever seen one move. Tom was 2 miles out checking fence when he saw the smoke line building wrong-colored and wrong-fast on the horizon, and rode back hard enough to lame the horse getting there. To find her already at the well, already soaking feed sacks, already doing exactly what he'd have told her to do if there'd been time to tell her anything. They fought it through the night. Wet sacks against the line. A fire break dug by hand along the north pasture. Cattle driven to the creek where the fire couldn't follow. Her hands blistered, and she kept working past it, refusing when Tom told her to rest, matching him step for step through smoke thick enough to blind them both more than once. At one point, the fire jumped the break entirely, and Tom went back in for a calf too young to outrun the smoke, and came out with his sleeve burned through and Josephine already there with water before he'd finished coughing. "You could have waited at the house," he said after. Both of them black with soot, the pasture smoking behind them, the herd alive, the house standing. "You didn't wait either," she said. His arms were shaking by the time they got back to the porch. And it wasn't only the smoke. This wasn't an arrangement anymore. Hadn't been for a long time. He carried her the last quarter mile on his shoulders, both of them too spent to walk it properly, and didn't say so out loud. He didn't need to. Bartholomew came out to the ranch that same autumn, 40 years old and comfortable in the flat, unhurried authority of a man who'd spent years representing a company bigger than any single rancher's objections, driving a fine buggy that had no business on the rutted road out to Calderland. "Union Pacific's looking at a spur line through this county," Kane said, not bothering to dismount. "Your quarter section sits square in the surveyed path. I can offer you a fair price now, or wait and find out what the railroad's lawyers consider fair once they've got a court order behind them." "This land's proved up and filed," Tom said. 5 years residency, same as the law requires. Nothing for a court to order." He'd said those exact words to himself more than once since the notice arrived, as if repeating them enough times might make a stranger's paperwork agree with the facts of his own life. "Paperwork has a way of getting complicated," Kane said, mild and unhurried, like a man who'd made that threat sound pleasant many times before. "I'd hate for complications to find their way to a man with a young girl depending on him. Tom didn't raise his voice, which Josephine, 10, watching from the porch, would remember later as more frightening than shouting would have been. She had learned in 3 years on that ranch that Tom's quietest voice was always the one that meant the most. "Get off my land, Mr. Kane," he said flatly, "and don't threaten my daughter in her own yard." It was the first time he'd said the word daughter out loud to anyone, and it came out steadier than he expected, as though some part of him had been waiting years for the right moment to say it. Kane's buggy was already turning before either of them fully registered it had been said. He didn't know it yet, but the man driving away had just decided this refusal was one he intended to collect on eventually, however long it took. "This one's already found its way to places I didn't expect when I first sat down to write it. Brazil, Nigeria, India, the Philippines, corners of the world I'm only starting to learn. If Tom and Josephine are keeping you good company tonight, a like helps more than you'd think. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment. Now, it's going to take 12 years for Bartholomew Kane's patience to run out. Prairie Grove has no idea what's coming." Josephine's teacher, Miss Adeline Cross, pulled Tom aside at the schoolhouse the spring Josephine turned 15. "She's the sharpest student I've had in 8 years, Miss Cross said. Reads faster than I can supply her books. Argues a point like she's already stood in front of a judge. A girl like that could do more than marry a rancher and keep his house." Tom sat with that a long while on the porch that evening. The same porch Kane's buggy had once turned around from. The same one where Daniel Voss, 19 that summer, and the serious young hand Tom had taken on 2 summers back, was mending a section of rail that didn't strictly need mending, close enough to overhear, without meaning to. "I heard something today," Tom told Josephine over supper. "Miss Cross thinks you could study for something more than this county's got to offer." "This county's got you in it," Josephine said. "That's enough offer for me." "It isn't, though," Tom said. "Not if it's the only reason you're staying." He looked at his own hands, rancher's hands, nothing like the kind a person needed for reading law. "Your mother, Mary, used to say the worst thing you could do for somebody you loved was keep them small so you wouldn't have to miss them. Took me a long time to understand that. Took losing her to understand it at all." Josephine didn't answer that night, but she started reading the law books Miss Cross lent her with a different hunger after that. And Tom noticed and said nothing and let her get there in her own time. She left for Topeka in the spring of 1878, 15 years old, younger than most who made that trip alone, but nobody who'd known her since the train platform was much surprised. Few firms in the territory would take on a woman clerk at all, and fewer still would pay her a wage equal to the men doing the same filings beside her. But one senior partner in Topeka had read a letter from Miss Cross and agreed to see what the girl could do, on the understanding, unstated but well understood by everyone involved, that she'd have to outwork every clerk in the office twice over just to be allowed to stay. Tom drove her to the station himself. "You don't have to prove anything by going," he said, in almost the same spot he'd first found her 15 years before. "I'm not going to prove anything to you," Josephine said. "I already know what you think of me." She stayed a moment longer than the goodbye strictly required, then finally let go of his hand. "I'm going because you taught me a fire doesn't wait for you to feel ready before it comes." Figured the same's true of everything else worth doing. Daniel Voss stood by the corral the whole time the train was loading, doing nothing that resembled work, his eyes fixed on the platform until the last car disappeared around the bend. Tom noticed that too, the way he noticed most things at that ranch, and said nothing about it. The way he'd once said nothing while she found her own way toward books he'd never fully understood. He watched the train until it was a smudge on the horizon, then drove home to a ranch that felt, for the first time in 8 years, entirely too quiet. Every chore a reminder of a second set of hands that wasn't there. Every book still on her shelf, a small ache he hadn't expected. The papers arrived in the spring of 1885, 7 years later, delivered by a county deputy who looked almost apologetic about it. Congress had handed railroads millions of acres of public land back in the 60s to get the tracks built, and men like Kane, now a senior land agent for the Union Pacific, had gotten used to treating anyone still homesteading near a surveyed line as an inconvenience to be cleared, rather than a neighbor to be respected. Haines' filing disputed the validity of Tom's homestead patent, claiming he'd failed continuous residency during the exact 3 weeks in 1873 when he'd been fighting the Prairie Fire alongside half the county. It was a technicality dressed up as law, built on an altered county residency ledger. Though Tom, reading it alone at his kitchen table, had no way yet to prove that part. He read it 3 times before he fully understood what it meant, and then sat a long while in the quiet kitchen doing arithmetic he didn't want the answer to. 20 years of work and a stranger's signature on a piece of paper might be enough to erase all of it inside 6 weeks. The hearing was set 6 weeks out. Kane's men staked survey markers along the north pasture the following week. The same pasture a father and a 10-year-old girl had once saved from fire together, now marked to be taken on paper instead. When Tom rode out to pull the stakes himself, 2 of Kane's hired men blocked him with more confidence than the law actually gave them. "I've farmed this ground 20 years, Tom said. "Reckon the trespassing's on your side of this conversation." He pulled the stakes anyway and rode off before it could turn into anything worse, though both men watched him go with the patience of men who'd been told to expect trouble and weren't in a hurry to avoid it. Word reached Josephine in Topeka 9 days later, in a letter from Miss Cross that traveled faster than anything Tom would ever have thought to send. She was 22 by then, 2 years into practicing under a senior partner's sponsorship, sharp enough with land filings that half the firm's junior work already passed through her hands first. She read the letter twice, put down a case 3 days from finished, and spent 4 nights in the firm's records room instead of her own bed, working through every Union Pacific filing she could reach. She found the discrepancy on the 4th night, a difference in handwriting between 2 pages of the Prairie Grove residency ledger, and a name in the firm's own correspondence she recognized instantly. A former county clerk, dismissed for cause in 1874, who'd landed a curiously well-paid position at the Union Pacific Land Office the following year. She found the man himself 2 days later, retired outside Topeka in a small clapboard house at the edge of town, his hands unsteady with age. It took her most of an afternoon to get him talking, and when he finally agreed to come with her, it wasn't the affidavit that moved him. It was her asking, plainly, whether he wanted to spend what years he had left carrying what Kane had asked him to do, or whether he'd rather have a chance to set it down. He was quiet a long time after that question, staring at his own hands, and when he finally answered, his voice shook in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I told myself it was a small thing," he said. "1 line changed on 1 page. Told myself for 11 years it didn't hurt anybody real." He looked up at her. Didn't know back then there'd be a girl someday asking me to fix it. She caught the last train to Prairie Grove with the old clerk beside her and the ledger page in a borrowed folio, and didn't sleep the whole way, understanding, the way Tom once had during the fire, that arriving in time mattered as much as arriving with the truth. By the time Josephine reached the courthouse, the hearing was nearly over, Kane's lawyer having built the case entirely on the altered ledger, Tom having no answer strong enough to counter it, the judge rising to deliver a ruling that would have ended, that morning, with the Calder homestead forfeit. The doors opened before he finished his first sentence. "Dad," Josephine said, crossing the room fast, folio pressed to her chest. "I'm here." She didn't lead with the ledger page. Not right away. She led the old clerk to the front of the room instead and let him speak for himself, her hand steady on his elbow the whole way up the aisle. He hadn't rehearsed it, and it showed. The halting, unpolished confession of a man who'd carried something 11 years and finally set it down in front of the one town that had once trusted him with its records. He named the sum Cain had paid him. He named the date. His voice cracked once, midway through, and he stopped, and the whole room waited without a sound until he found it again and kept going. He looked, more than once, directly at Cain while he said it, and Cain, for the first time since anyone in that room had known him, had nothing composed to say back. The judge asked exactly the questions the clerk's testimony demanded, examined the ledger himself against the surrounding pages, and found what a 10-year-old girl fighting a fire beside her father 12 years before could have told the whole courtroom without a law degree: that Tom Calder had never once abandoned anything that was his. The claim was dismissed. Cain left without a word, and left within the month without his position too. The Union Pacific having no appetite for keeping a man whose fraud had just been read aloud in open court, in front of the same shareholders' newspaper that covered every railroad scandal in the territory with obvious relish. Tom didn't say anything on the courthouse steps. Not right away. He just pulled her into the kind of embrace a man doesn't give a hired hand or a distant relation. The kind he'd spent 15 years quietly, permanently deciding to call his own. She felt smaller in his arms than she had on the platform to Topeka 7 years before. And he understood, holding her, that he'd spent every one of those 7 years half-braced for a telegram telling him she wasn't coming back at all. "You didn't have to leave the firm to come do this," he said finally. "Wasn't a decision," Josephine said. "Wasn't ever going to be anything else." She stayed in Prairie Grove after that, opening a small law practice above the Mercantile, the first the county had ever had run by a woman, and saw no shortage of homesteaders grateful there was finally someone in town who understood how a filing could be twisted and how to twist it back. Miss Cross, retired from teaching by then, liked to tell anyone who'd listen that she'd always known that sharp-eyed girl in the third row would end up arguing law in front of a judge someday. Though she was honest enough to admit she'd never once imagined the case would be her own family's. Daniel Voss found reasons to be at her office rather more often than legal business strictly required. Reasons that had started, if either of them had been honest about it, on a station platform 7 years earlier, and never quite stopped. Tom noticed that too, and said nothing, the same way he'd once let her find her own way toward everything else that mattered. The ranch stood exactly as it had for 20 years, the north pasture green again where fire had once taken it. A father and the daughter he'd chosen off a train platform, who had chosen every day since to come back. I keep coming back to the fact that Tom never actually said the word daughter until a man threatened to take her home away from her. 15 years of raising her, and it took a stranger's threat to make him say it out loud in his own yard. Some of us are like that. The love's already there, sitting quiet for years, doing all the work without ever once needing the word, and it takes something frightening to scare it into language. If that's you too, maybe don't wait for the courthouse doors to open. Thank you, truly, for riding with me today. Until next time, friend, keep riding.